The crystal chess set my grandfather brought from Vienna had survived 2 world wars, a transatlantic journey, and 70 years in my family's keeping. It survived everything except my own children's greed. I discovered this in the worst way possible while visiting my daughter Melanie's home for Sunday dinner. There, displayed prominently on her entryway table like some trophy, sat my mother's antique silver tea service. The same tea service that had been locked in my bedroom closet, wrapped in acid-free cloth, waiting to be passed down properly after my death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Where did you get that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Melanie's smile faltered for just a moment before she waved dismissively. Oh, Thomas brought it over last week. He said you were decluttering and wanted us to have some family pieces. Now rather than later. Thomas, my son, the executor of my will, who had a spare key to my house for emergencies. Before I could respond, my grandson came bounding down the stairs, wearing my late husband Edgar's pocket watch, the one his own grandfather had carried through the trenches of World War I. A family treasure meant for a milestone birthday, not to be casually worn by a 16-year-old who had already lost 3 smartphones in the past year. That's when I knew. The missing crystal vase I couldn't find last month. The disappearing first edition books from Edgar's study. The empty spaces in my jewelry box I'd attributed to my aging memory. My children had been systematically looting my home, dividing my treasures between themselves while I still drew breath. Taking what was never theirs to take. Yet. At 73, I, Lenora Buckminster, had spent my life as a collector, not just of beautiful things, but of beautiful moments. I had been a museum curator for nearly 40 years, specializing in decorative arts. My husband Edgar and I had built our modest collection piece by piece, saving for treasures that carried our family histories through generations. Edgar had passed 5 years ago, leaving me alone in our Victorian home in Millfield, a small town where everyone knew your business before you did. We had 2 children, Thomas, now 48, a financial advisor who measured life in portfolios and projections, and Melanie, 45, who had inherited my eye for beautiful things but not the patience to earn them. They'd always taken my generosity for granted. When Thomas needed money for his first office space, I sold my grandmother's pearl necklace. When Melanie divorced her first husband, I paid her legal fees with money Edgar and I had saved for our dream trip to Greece. I never complained. What? Mother doesn't sacrifice for her children? But standing in Melanie's entryway that Sunday, something fundamental shifted inside me. The silver tea service gleaming under her chandelier wasn't just silver. It was Sunday afternoons with my mother, learning the ritual of brewing a proper pot of Earl Grey. It was the pride in her eyes when she passed it to me after my wedding, saying, "This is your heritage now, Nora. Keep it polished and keep it close." I said nothing during dinner. I smiled and nodded as Thomas detailed his latest investment success. I complimented Melanie on the roast that her housekeeper had clearly prepared. I answered questions about my arthritis and pretended not to notice. When they exchanged looks, silently communicating in that way siblings do when they think their elderly parent is becoming a burden. "Mom, have you given any more thought to moving to Sunny Pines?" Thomas asked while helping himself to seconds. Sunny Pines was the assisted living facility on the edge of town. Pleasant enough, but still a place where old people were tucked, away from sight. "Actually, I've been thinking about what to do with the house," I said, my voice casual as I sipped my water. Their attention snapped to me instantly. The house, my 3-story Victorian on Maple Avenue, the most desirable street in Millfield, was what they had been circling like vultures for years. In a town where property values had tripled in a decade, my mortgage-free home was worth well over $1 million. Oh? Melanie tried to sound disinterested and failed spectacularly. "Yes," I continued, It's so much space for just one person. All those rooms to clean. That's what we've been saying. Thomas nodded vigorously. It makes perfect sense. To downsize now, while you're still healthy enough to make the transition easily. I smiled. You're absolutely right. The relief on their faces was almost comical. Thomas launched into his prepared speech about how he'd already spoken to a real estate agent friend who could list the house when the time was right. Melanie began planning which of my remaining furniture pieces would fit in a cozy apartment at Sunny Pines. They didn't notice I hadn't actually agreed to anything at all. After dinner, as I prepared to leave, I paused by the silver tea service. This really is beautiful, isn't it? I ran my fingers along the ornate handle of the teapot. It looks perfect there, Melanie said, standing next to me. Much better than locked away in your closet. Things should be used and loved, I agreed, by people who truly value them. I left shortly after, driving myself home despite Thomas's insistence that he should take me. I've been driving for 55 years, I reminded him. I think I can manage 6 blocks. When I arrived home, I didn't immediately go inside. Instead, I sat in my car and looked at the beautiful old Victorian that had sheltered my family for decades. Edgar and I had purchased it when it was barely more than a shambles, pouring our hearts and savings into restoring it room by room. We'd raised our children here, hosted countless Christmas dinners and summer barbecues, weathered storms both, literal and figurative, beneath its roof. I loved this house, but I realized, sitting there in the gathering darkness, that I loved my dignity more. Inside, the first thing I did was check Edgar's study. As I suspected, the built-in bookshelves had several conspicuous gaps where first editions had once stood. A quick look in my jewelry box confirmed more missing pieces: my mother's cameo, my grandmother's garnet earrings. The crystal cabinet in the dining room was half empty. I methodically went through each room, making notes of what was missing and who likely had taken each item. By midnight, I had 8 pages of losses, family treasures that couldn't be replaced, taken without so much as asking. Some items I'd been saving for specific grandchildren when they were old enough to appreciate them. Others were meant to stay in this house as long as I did. I poured myself a small glass of Edgar's favorite scotch. Thankfully, the children hadn't yet raided his liquor cabinet, and sat in his leather chair by the window. Edgar would have been furious. He'd worked so hard to build our life, to preserve our heritage for the next generation. But the next generation couldn't even wait for us to be gone before dividing the spoils. "What would you do, Edgar?" I whispered. "To the empty room." In the silence, I could almost hear his reply. "Nora, you've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for. Do what needs to be done." The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Harriet Simon, my oldest friend and a retired attorney who had handled Edgar's will. The second was to Marcus Green, a realtor who had been trying to convince me to sell my house for years. The third was to Caroline West, the director of the Millfield Historical Society, who had once told me at a fundraiser, "If you ever decide to part with that magnificent home of yours, please think of us first." By lunchtime, I had set my plan in motion. By dinner, I felt lighter than I had in years. I slept more soundly that night than I had since Edgar died. Over the next week, I was busy, busier than I'd been in years. I visited my bank and met with financial advisors, not my son. I sorted through closets and drawers, truly decluttering this time, but with purpose and intention. I had lunch with old friends I'd neglected. I even went to the senior center I'd always avoided and signed up for their art history lecture series. Thomas called twice, each time with just a quick question about the house. Had I thought about listing it yet? Had I looked at any retirement communities? I kept my answers vague and changed the subject to his children or his work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Melanie didn't call at all, but she did send a text. Found Mom's old recipe box in the attic stuff you gave me. Do you want it back or should I keep it? I hadn't given her anything from the attic, and my recipe box was still in my kitchen cabinet. The lie was so brazen it was almost impressive. The following Sunday, I invited both my children and their families for dinner at my home. I've made a decision about the house, I told them, and I'd like to discuss it with everyone together. They arrived early, of course. Thomas brought a bottle of expensive champagne. To celebrate new beginnings, he said with a wink. Melanie brought a glossy brochure from Sunny Pines, with apartment layouts helpfully circled in red marker. My grandchildren immediately scattered throughout the house, the younger ones racing upstairs to the window seat they loved in the third-floor hallway, the older ones congregating in the kitchen to raid the snacks I'd prepared. Thomas's wife, Patricia, immediately began assessing the dining room furniture with her eyes, while Melanie's husband Robert checked his phone, bored already. I served a simple meal, Edgar's favorite pot roast with roasted vegetables and fresh bread from the local bakery. I'd even made my famous apple pie for dessert. For a little while, it almost felt like old times, the house full of family and laughter. After dessert, when everyone was satisfied and mellow, Thomas clinked his water glass with a spoon. I believe Mom has an announcement to make, he said, smiling at me encouragingly. I looked around the table at my family, my children who couldn't wait to claim their inheritance, my grandchildren focused on their phones, my in-laws who were already mentally redecorating my home. Yes, I do, I said, my voice steady. I've decided what to do about the house. Thomas leaned forward eagerly. We'll help with everything, Mom. The packing, the move. I've already spoken to a storage company for anything that won't fit it. Sunny Pines. I smiled. That's very thoughtful, but unnecessary. I'm not moving to Sunny Pines. Confusion flickered across their faces. The thing is, I continued calmly, I've noticed over the past few months that many of my possessions seem to have found new homes already. The table went utterly silent. Even the grandchildren looked up from their phones. My silver tea service, Edgar's first edition Hemingway collection, my mother's cameo, the Vienna crystal chess set, my grandmother's garnet earrings. I listed each item slowly, watching their expressions shift from confusion to discomfort. These things, and many more, have mysteriously migrated to your homes without my knowledge or consent. Mom, Thomas began, his voice taking on that placating tone he used with difficult clients, we thought you were decluttering. You've been talking about simplifying for years. Simplifying, I repeated. Is that why the items that have migrated happen to be the most valuable things I own? Is that why no one thought to ask me first? Melanie's face flushed red. You're always saying you want us to have your things eventually. What's the difference between now and later? The difference, I said, my voice still calm, is respect. The difference is asking rather than taking. The difference is allowing me to decide when and how to part with my own possessions. We didn't mean any harm, Thomas insisted. We were trying to help. By stealing from me? I asked. The word hung in the air like a thundercloud. Stealing. Such an ugly word for family to use with family. But what else could I call it? That's not fair, Melanie protested. It's not stealing when it's family. These things would be ours eventually anyway. Eventually, I echoed. But I'm still here now. I stood up and walked to the sideboard, where I'd placed a stack of folders earlier that day. I returned to the table and handed one to Thomas, one to Melanie. What's this? Thomas asked, opening his folder. That, I said, is a complete inventory of every item taken from my home without permission. I've documented when I last saw each piece, its approximate value, and which of you currently has it in your possession. Their faces paled as they flipped through the pages. Mother, this is ridiculous, Melanie sputtered. You're acting like we're criminals. I ignored her outburst. You're both welcome to keep everything you've taken. Consider it your early inheritance. Relief flickered across their faces, quickly replaced by wariness. They knew me well enough to sense there was more coming. As for the rest of my estate, I continued, I've made some changes. I pulled out another document, this one a single page, and placed it on the table where everyone could see it. This is the deed to this house, I said. As of yesterday, I no longer own it. What? Thomas nearly shouted. You sold the house without telling us? Not exactly, I said. I donated it to the Millfield Historical Society. The silence that followed was absolute. I could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. You... what? Melanie finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The Millfield Historical Society has been looking for a permanent location for years, I explained. This house, with its architectural significance and connection to the town's history, is perfect for them. They'll preserve it exactly as it is, open parts of it to the public for tours and educational programs, and, here's the best part, I get to live in it for the rest of my life. Thomas's financial brain engaged first. But the tax implications are quite favorable, I finished for him. Harriet helped me structure the donation to maximize the tax benefits. And since I'm now officially the house's caretaker, I receive a small stipend from the Historical Society for maintenance costs. But it was supposed to be ours, Melanie said, no longer bothering to hide her dismay. We were counting on what? I asked. On selling it and splitting the proceeds once I was safely tucked away at Sunny Pines? On having your inheritance before I'm even gone? That's not fair, Thomas protested, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. No, I agreed. It wasn't fair. Just as it wasn't fair for you to take my treasured possessions without asking. Just as it wasn't fair to assume you were entitled to decide when I should leave my home. I looked around at their stunned faces. Even my grandchildren were paying attention now, witnessing a side of their grandmother they'd never seen before. The house will be preserved, I said more gently. Your children and their children will be able to visit it, to see where their family history unfolded. Isn't that better than having it sold to strangers who would gut it and modernize away all its character? No one had an answer for that. And as for my remaining possessions, I continued, I've decided to be much more intentional about what happens to them. Some pieces will stay with the house as part of the Historical Society's collection. Others I've earmarked for specific grandchildren, when they're old enough to appreciate them. And some things I'll continue to enjoy myself for as long as I'm able. Thomas was already thinking ahead, calculating what this meant for his expected inheritance. What about your savings? Your investments? I smiled. Half will eventually go to my grandchildren's education. The other half I plan to use myself. For what? Melanie asked incredulously. For living, I replied simply. I'm 73, not dead. I've started taking art history courses at the community college. Next month, I'm going on a 2-week tour of Italian museums with a group from the senior center. And next winter, I'm finally taking that trip to Greece that your father and I always dreamed about. Their expressions were a complex mix of emotions. Shock, disappointment, embarrassment, and perhaps from my oldest grandson at least, a hint of admiration. So that's it? Thomas finally asked. You've made all these decisions without consulting any of us? The irony of his complaint was apparently lost on him. Yes, I said. Just as you made decisions about my possessions without consulting me. Melanie stood up abruptly. I think we should go. Her voice was tight with suppressed anger. Come on, kids. Get your things. Of course, I said, standing as well. It's getting late. The departure was awkward. My grandchildren hugged me dutifully, confusion evident in their faces. My in-laws made vague comments about seeing me soon. Thomas and Melanie barely said goodbye at all. As the last car pulled away, I stood in the doorway of my home, still my home, though in a different way now, and felt an unexpected sense of peace wash over me. For the first time in years, I had taken control of my own story instead of allowing others to write it for me. I went inside and made myself a cup of tea, wishing fleetingly for my mother's silver service before reminding myself that it was just an object. The memories associated with it were still mine, even if the silver wasn't. The house felt different somehow, lighter, as if it too had been unburdened. Or perhaps it was just me, finally free from the weight of expectations and obligations that had slowly accumulated over decades of putting everyone else first. I took my tea into Edgar's study and sat in his leather chair by the window. The bookshelves had gaps where his prized first editions had once stood, but I found I didn't mind as much as before. Books were meant to be read, after all. I just hoped Thomas was actually reading them rather than keeping them locked in a display case as status symbols. "Well, Edgar," I said to the empty room, "I think I finally found my backbone." The next morning, my phone rang incessantly. I let it go to voicemail. Thomas had left 3 messages, each more conciliatory than the last, ending with an invitation to dinner to discuss options. Melanie had texted repeatedly, her messages evolving from angry, "I can't believe you would do this to your own children," to manipulative, "Dad would be so disappointed in how you're treating us." I responded to neither. Instead, I drove to the community college and registered for 2 more courses: Italian language and digital photography. On my way home, I stopped at the travel agency and put down a deposit on the Greece trip. When I pulled into my driveway, Caroline West from the Historical Society was waiting for me, practically bouncing with excitement. "Lenora, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I just couldn't wait to show you these preliminary plans for the museum areas." She spread blueprints across my kitchen table, pointing out how they would convert the formal parlor and Edgar's study into exhibition spaces, while keeping the family areas private for my use. They wanted to feature some of the original architectural elements in their first exhibition: the carved banister, the stained glass transom windows, the intricate plasterwork on the dining room ceiling. "And we'd love to interview you about the restoration process," she added. "Your work preserving this house is exactly the kind of local history we want to highlight." As she chattered enthusiastically about grant applications and educational programs, I felt a growing certainty that I'd made the right decision. This house deserved to be preserved, to be appreciated by people who would value its history and character. That evening, as I sat on my front porch enjoying the spring twilight, a car pulled up. Thomas got out, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. "Mom," he said, climbing the porch steps, "we need to talk." I gestured to the chair beside me. "Have a seat." He sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I spoke to your attorney today. She says the donation is final, irrevocable." "Yes," I agreed. That was the point. "But why?" he asked, and for the first time, I heard genuine confusion in his voice rather than calculation. "Why would you give away your biggest asset? Our inheritance?" I considered my son, this middle-aged man who had somehow become a stranger to me. "Do you remember when you were 10? I asked. "And you wanted to build a treehouse in the old oak?" He frowned, thrown by the change of subject. "Vaguely. Dad helped me build it." "Your father spent every weekend that summer working on that treehouse with you. Not because he particularly enjoyed carpentry, but because he wanted to share something with his son. To create memories that would last longer than any object ever could." Thomas looked away, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "The inheritance I wanted to leave you wasn't this house or the things in it," I continued. "It was the values your father and I tried to instill: respect, integrity, appreciation for beauty and history. Somewhere along the way, you and your Sisters started focusing on the physical assets instead of the legacy they represented. "That's not fair," he protested, but weakly. "When you and Melanie started taking my things without asking," I said, "you sent me a very clear message about what mattered to you, so I've adjusted my estate plans accordingly. By cutting us out completely? No, by redirecting my resources in ways that align with my values. The house will be preserved for future generations. Your children will receive support for their education. And yes, you and Melanie will receive less than you expected, but you've already helped yourselves to quite a bit, haven't you?" He had the grace to look ashamed, at least momentarily. "I didn't come here to argue," he said finally. "I came to understand." "And do you?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "I understand that we hurt you," he admitted. "I just don't understand why you had to respond so dramatically." I smiled sadly. "Because nothing less would have gotten your attention. Nothing less would have made you see me as a person with agency, rather than an elderly parent to be managed." The truth of my words hung between us in the gathering darkness. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Thomas stood up. "I should go. Patricia is waiting." I nodded. "Give my love to the children." He hesitated at the top of the porch steps. "Will you at least come to Sunday dinner next week? The kids miss you." "I'd like that," I said, "but I'll be away at a photography workshop in Boston. Perhaps the following week." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe even a reluctant respect. "I'll tell them," he said, and walked to his car. As I watched him drive away, I felt neither victory nor vindication, only a quiet certainty that I had finally stood up for myself, even if it had taken 73 years to get there. Inside, I picked up the brochure for the Greece trip and began making notes about what I wanted to see. The Parthenon, of course, and the museums in Athens, but also the smaller islands, the hidden coves and ancient villages that Edgar and I had dreamed of exploring together. "I'm finally going, Edgar," I whispered. "Better late than never." In the months that followed, my relationship with my children slowly evolved. There were difficult conversations, tearful apologies, mostly from Melanie, who had always been more emotional, and gradual steps toward a new kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Some of the stolen items mysteriously reappeared in my home. My mother's cameo was left on my dresser one day after Melanie visited. Thomas returned several of the first edition books, claiming he'd borrowed them to have them appraised for insurance purposes. I accepted these gestures without comment. The items themselves mattered less to me now than what they represented. My children's growing recognition that they had crossed a line, and their halting attempts to make amends. The Historical Society's plans for the house progressed steadily. They received a substantial grant to fund the renovations and hired a curator to begin organizing exhibitions. I found myself enjoying the process, sharing stories about the house's history with researchers and architects who genuinely cared about preserving its character. My own life expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. The art history courses led to an invitation to give a guest lecture at the local museum. The photography workshop sparked a passion that had me out at dawn, capturing the changing seasons in Millfield's historic district. My Italian lessons proved invaluable when I finally took that trip to Florence I'd been postponing for decades. One evening, as I sat in my garden reviewing the final itinerary for my upcoming Greece trip, I reflected on how differently things had turned out from what I'd expected in my 70s. Instead of gradually fading into the background of my children's lives, I had reclaimed the foreground of my own. The house that had nearly become a source of bitter contention was now secure in its future as a museum, protected from developers, and preserved for generations to come. My remaining possessions no longer felt like burdens to be distributed, but simply objects that enhanced my life when useful and beautiful. And my children? They were learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, that I was more than just their mother, more than a caretaker of heirlooms waiting to be claimed. I was Lenora Buckminster, curator, photographer, traveler, student, and finally, at 73, the author of my own story. As twilight deepened into dusk, I raised a glass of Edgar's favorite scotch in a toast to the future. Not the one I had planned, or the one my children had anticipated, but something new and unexpected. Something entirely my own. The first few days after my confrontation with Thomas and Melanie were eerily quiet. No frantic phone calls, no unannounced visits, no passive-aggressive text messages asking if I needed help around the house. The silence should have been peaceful, but instead, it hung over me like a storm cloud, the calm before the inevitable tempest. I busied myself with practical matters. Caroline West from the Historical Society brought over the formal paperwork. For the donation, thick stacks of legal documents that I reviewed carefully before signing. Harriet, ever the meticulous attorney even in retirement, sat with me for hours, explaining every clause and contingency. "You're absolutely certain about this, Lenora?" she asked one final time, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Once you sign, there's no reversing course." "I've never been more certain of anything," I said, taking the pen she offered. My signature was steady, decisive, no wavering, no hesitation. Harriet witnessed the documents, then gathered them up with a satisfied nod. "Edgar would be proud of you, you know. He always said you were the strongest person he'd ever met." I smiled, remembering how Edgar used to call me his quiet force of nature. He claimed I could move mountains without raising my voice, though in our later years he would teasingly add, "But heaven help us all when you do raise it." "I'm not so sure he'd approve of me giving away the house," I admitted. Harriet snorted. "Edgar would have been furious about what Thomas and Melanie did. He might have suggested something far less diplomatic than your solution." After Harriet left, I wandered through the rooms of my home, still mine for the duration of my life, but now with a secured future beyond me. Each creaking floorboard and stubborn window latch had a story. The dent in the dining room wall from when Thomas got his first baseball bat. The height markers penciled inside the kitchen pantry door, tracking Melanie's growth from toddler to teenager. The slight warp in the hardwood floor where Edgar and I had danced on our 40th anniversary, spinning round and round until we were dizzy with champagne and happiness. I'd spent the past 5 years rattling around this house alone, a widow cataloging memories. Now, I realized with startling clarity, I'd been so focused on preserving the past that I'd forgotten to build a present for myself. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh notebook and began making lists. Places I wanted to visit, skills I wanted to learn, books I'd meant to read for years but never found time for. By midnight, I had filled nearly 10 pages. I slept better that night than I had in months. The storm finally broke 3 days later. I was in the garden, pruning roses that had grown wild and tangled during my period of neglect, when a car door slammed in my driveway. Heavy footsteps approached, crunching on the gravel path. "What the hell were you thinking?" I turned to find Melanie standing behind me, her face flushed with anger. Designer sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly highlighted hair. She clutched her phone in one hand, a sheaf of papers in the other. "Good morning to you too, Melanie," I said calmly, turning back to my roses. "Don't you good morning me, Mother. I just got off the phone with the family attorney. Is it true?" "Did you really donate the house?" I snipped a particularly stubborn cane before answering. "Yes." "You can't do that. You can't just—" "I give away our inheritance." I set down my pruning shears and turned to face my daughter. In that moment, she looked so young, so much like the petulant teenager who had once stomped her foot when I refused to buy her a car for her 16th birthday. But she wasn't a teenager anymore. She was a 45-year-old woman who should have known better. "It wasn't yours to inherit yet," I said quietly. "And given recent events, I decided to ensure the house's future aligned with my wishes, not yours." This is about the tea service, isn't it? And those old books? For God's sake, Mother, if you wanted them back, you could have just asked. The audacity of her statement was so breathtaking that I almost laughed. Asked for my own possessions? To be returned to me? Things that were taken without my knowledge or permission in the first place? Melanie's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before hardening into defensiveness. We were helping you declutter. Everyone knows how overwhelming it is for seniors to manage a big house full of stuff. We were being proactive. Proactive, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. Is that what you call systematically removing the most valuable items from my home? How thoughtful of you. You're blowing this completely out of proportion. They're just things. If they're just things, why did you want them so badly? Why not wait until I offered them to you, or until I was gone? She didn't have an answer. For that. I bent down to collect the rose clippings I'd accumulated, gathering them into a small pile. The house will be preserved as a historical site. Your children and grandchildren will be able to visit it, to learn about their heritage. I'd think you'd be pleased. Pleased? Melanie's voice rose an octave. You're punishing us. Taking away something that should have come to us and giving it to strangers. I straightened, feeling every one of my 73 years in the creak of my knees and the ache in my lower back. The Historical Society isn't strangers. They're dedicated professionals who will care for this house and its history long after we're all gone. And I'm not punishing you, Melanie. I'm making choices about my own property while I still can. Thomas is furious, she said, as if that would change my mind. He's talking about challenging the donation. He's welcome to try. Harriet made sure everything was legally sound. My daughter stared at me, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. I don't even recognize you anymore. The mother I knew would never do something like this to her own children. Her words struck deeper than she knew. The mother she knew. The woman who had spent decades putting everyone else's needs before her own. The curator of family harmony at all costs. Perhaps you never really knew me at all, I said softly. Or perhaps I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be before I subordinated everything to being your mother. Melanie flinched as if I'd slapped her. So that's it? You're just done with being a mother? Of course not. But my role as your mother doesn't obligate me to let you take advantage of me. It doesn't require me to surrender my autonomy or my property before. I'm ready, she shook her head, eyes glistening with tears that I couldn't tell were genuine or strategic. Melanie had always been skilled at turning on the waterworks when it suited her purposes. What am I supposed to tell Robert? We had plans for that. Money. We were going to buy a vacation home in Nantucket. There it was, the real issue. Not the house itself, not its history or the memories it contained, but what it could be converted into. Liquid assets, financial opportunities, a second home in an exclusive location that would cement their social standing. Tell Robert whatever. You like? I said, gathering my gardening tools. Though you might start by telling him the truth, that you both counted your inheritance before I was even dead, and now you're disappointed because your plans were built on a foundation you didn't actually own yet. I walked past her toward the house, my back straight despite the gardening aches. At the door, I paused and looked back. Melanie stood exactly where I'd left her, still clutching her phone and those papers. Printouts of legal documents, I guessed, that Thomas had sent her to wave in my face. I'm making a pot of tea, I said. You're welcome to join me if you'd like to have a civil conversation. She didn't follow me inside. A few minutes later, I heard her car start and the crunch of tires on gravel as she drove away. I made my tea anyway, settling at the kitchen table with the community college course catalog. Italian language, digital photography, art history, creative writing. So many possibilities. I circled 4 courses, then reached for my phone to register. The next day, Thomas arrived at my door, all business in his crisp suit and polished shoes. Unlike his sister, he'd regained his composure, presenting himself as the rational problem solver. "I've been consulting with some colleagues," he said, not bothering with pleasantries as he seated himself at my dining room table. "There may be a way to structure a partial revocation of the donation, if we can prove diminished capacity or undue influence." "Stop right there," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "I am not suffering from diminished capacity, and no one influenced my decision except you and your sister, with your unauthorized removal of my possessions." Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable, but pressed on. "Mom, be reasonable. This house is a significant asset. The tax implications alone were thoroughly examined by Harriet Simon, who knows more about estate law than you ever will. The donation is structured to provide maximum tax benefits for the estate while ensuring I can remain in my home for life. The Historical Society gains a valuable property, the community gains a museum, and I gain peace of mind knowing this house will be preserved rather than gutted and flipped after I'm gone." He blinked, clearly not expecting such a detailed rebuttal. "But your financial security is not your concern," I finished for him. "I have more than enough to live comfortably for whatever time I have left, with plenty set aside for my grandchildren's education." "And what about Melanie and me?" There it was again, the entitled expectation that had led us to this impasse in the first place. "You and your sister have already helped yourselves to quite a bit of your inheritance," I said coolly. "The silver tea service alone is worth nearly $20,000. Edgar's first editions, my mother's jewelry. Oh, I've estimated the total value of what you've taken at close to $100,000. Consider that your share." Thomas's face flushed dark red. "That's absurd. A few family heirlooms don't compare to the value of this property." "Then return them," I suggested. "All of them. Every book, every piece of silver, every crystal goblet and porcelain figurine. Return everything you took without permission, and perhaps we can revisit this conversation." His expression told me everything I needed to know. He had no intention of returning anything, not when he'd already incorporated those items into his own home, already mentally registered them as his possessions. "I thought not," I said quietly. Thomas adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd had since college. "Mom, I don't think you understand the consequences of what you've done. This changes everything. Retirement plans, financial projections. I understand perfectly. You and Melanie built financial plans on the assumption that you'd inherit substantial assets from me, and now those plans need to be adjusted. That's unfortunate, but it's hardly a crisis. You're both successful adults with good incomes. You'll manage." He stared at me as if I'd started speaking in tongues. This version of his mother, practical, firm, unbending, was clearly foreign to him. "Dad wouldn't have wanted this," he said finally, playing what he thought was his trump card. I smiled. "Sadly. Your father wouldn't have wanted his children stealing from their mother either, yet here we are." The conversation deteriorated from there. Thomas cycled through all 5 stages of grief in the span of 20 minutes. Denial that the donation was legal, anger at my betrayal, bargaining for some compromise that would preserve his expected windfall, depression about his thwarted plans, and finally, a grudging acceptance that I would not be swayed. "So that's your final word on the matter?" he asked, standing to leave. "It is," I confirmed. "Though I hope it isn't the final word between us as mother and son." "I still love you, Thomas. I just don't trust you anymore." He flinched at that but nodded stiffly before walking out. I watched him drive away, wondering if he would ever truly understand why I had done what I did. Not just to secure the house's future or to punish him and Melanie, but to reclaim my own agency after years of slowly surrendering it, piece by piece, to the expectations of others. The following weeks brought a brittle peace. Thomas and Melanie retreated to lick their wounds and recalibrate their expectations. My grandchildren, caught in the middle, were confused by the sudden family tension. I made a point of reaching out to them directly, sending books to Thomas's teenage son who shared his grandfather's love of literature, having lunch with Melanie's daughter, who was struggling to choose a college major, taking my youngest grandson to the Children's Museum where I'd once been a docent. I was determined that my relationships with my grandchildren would not become casualties of this conflict with their parents. They were innocent in all this, and I refused to let them believe, even for a moment, that my love for them was diminished. Meanwhile, I threw myself into my new activities with the energy of someone who had wasted too much time already. I attended my first photography class with nervous excitement, feeling oddly young as I fumbled with f-stops and shutter speeds alongside fellow seniors and a handful of college students. My Italian lessons were challenging in the best possible way, stretching my mind in directions it hadn't bent in decades. The Historical Society moved forward with their plans for the house. Architects and preservationists came to document original features. Curators inventoried built-in elements of historical significance. Caroline visited often, her enthusiasm for the project infectious. "We're thinking of calling it the Buckminster House Museum," she told me one afternoon as we reviewed floor plans, "to honor your family's stewardship of the property." "That's very kind," I said, "but there's no need. The house has its own history beyond my family." Caroline smiled. "That's true, but without your donation, this history might have been lost. Besides, naming it after your family means your grandchildren and their children will always know their connection to this place." I hadn't thought of it that way, that my decision could create a different kind of legacy, one that extended beyond personal inheritance to community heritage. It was a comforting thought. One morning in late April, I was having coffee on my front porch when a familiar car pulled into my driveway. It was Patricia, Thomas's wife, alone for once without my son in tow. "May I join you?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. "Of course," I said, surprised but pleased. Of all my in-laws, Patricia had always been the most genuine, the least concerned with status or appearances. She settled beside me, accepting the cup of coffee I offered. For several minutes, we sat in companionable silence, watching a pair of cardinals flit among the rhododendron bushes. "Thomas doesn't know I'm here," she said finally. "He'd be furious if he did." "Is that so?" I kept my tone neutral, curious about her purpose. Patricia nodded, turning the coffee cup in her hands. "He and Melanie have been meeting, plotting ways to challenge the donation. Legal strategies, character witnesses who could testify about your state of mind." I sighed. "I suspected as much. Harriet warned me they might try something like this." "It won't work," Patricia said with unexpected firmness. "And I told Thomas as much. It will only waste money and destroy what's left of your relationship with them." "Thank you for that," I said, genuinely touched by her intervention. "May I ask why you're telling me this?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Because I understand why you did it," she said finally. "More than you might think." Patricia set down her coffee cup and reached into her purse, withdrawing a small, worn leather journal. This was my grandmother's diary. She kept it during the last years of her life, when my mother and aunts were, well, doing exactly what Thomas and Melanie did to you. Taking her things, making decisions about her life without consulting her, treating her like she was already gone. She handed me the journal, opening it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was shaky but determined. The words, clear despite the yellowing paper. "They think I don't notice when another piece of my life disappears. The silver from my mother, gone from the drawer. My wedding china, vanished plate by plate. They speak around me, not to me. They plan my future, as if I have no say in it. But I am still here. I am still thinking. I am still me." I closed the journal gently, returning it to Patricia with a hand that trembled slightly. "Thank you for sharing this with me. My grandmother never stood up for herself the way you have," Patricia continued. "She just got quieter and smaller until one day she seemed to give up altogether. She died 6 months after moving into the nursing home my mother chose for her, surrounded by strangers and institutional furniture instead of her own cherished things." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be exactly as you are, stubborn and clear-eyed and unwilling to disappear before your time." She smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. "Besides, I never really liked that house in Nantucket Melanie was so set on. Too pretentious by half." I laughed, surprised and delighted by this unexpected alliance. "Will you get in trouble for coming here?" Patricia shrugged. "Probably, but Thomas will get over it eventually. He always does." After she left, I sat for a long time, thinking about Patricia's grandmother and all the other elderly parents who quietly surrendered their autonomy, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to surrender but life itself. I had come so close to being one of them, drifting toward irrelevance in my own family, accepting the gradual erasure of my preferences and authority as an inevitable part of aging. Not anymore. I would age on my own terms, facing whatever limitations time imposed with the same clear-eyed pragmatism I'd brought to every other phase of life. That afternoon, I received an email from the community college confirming my registration for the summer session. 4 courses. Ambitious, perhaps, but exhilarating in its challenge. I would be the oldest student in most of my classes, no doubt, but that didn't concern me. Age had finally granted me the freedom to learn for pure pleasure rather than practical application. I was still at my computer when the phone rang. It was Melanie, her voice tense but controlled. "Mother, we need to talk. This situation has gotten out of hand." "Which situation is that exactly?" I asked, genuinely curious which aspect of our current discord had prompted this call. "All of it. The house, the accusations about taking your things, this ridiculous feud. It's not good for anyone, especially the grandchildren. They're confused and upset." "I agree that family discord is hard on children," I said carefully. "That's why I've been making a special effort to maintain my individual relationships with each of them." "That's not enough," Melanie insisted. "They need to see their family whole again. We're having a dinner on Sunday. Everyone will be there. You should come." It wasn't quite an invitation, more a summons. I considered declining, on principle, but the thought of seeing my grandchildren tipped the scale. "What time?" I asked. 6 o'clock. "And Mother? Let's agree to set aside our differences for one evening, shall we? For the children's sake." I bit back a retort about who had created those differences in the first place. "I'll do my part," I promised. Sunday arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind that would have once inspired me to polish the good silver and set the table on the patio for an alfresco family dinner. Now, I was the guest rather than the hostess, arriving at Melanie's door with a bouquet of flowers from my garden and a homemade apple tart, my grandson Jacob's favorite. The atmosphere was strained despite efforts at normalcy. Thomas and Patricia were already there, he stiffly formal, she warmly sympathetic. Melanie's husband Robert looked uncomfortable, as he often did during family gatherings. The grandchildren, sensing the tension, were uncharacteristically subdued. Dinner itself was pleasant enough. Melanie had ordered catering from an upscale restaurant in town. She'd never enjoyed cooking the way I did, and the conversation stayed carefully neutral. Weather, local news, the grandchildren's activities and achievements. No mention of the house, the donation, or the family rift that had prompted this orchestrated display of unity. It wasn't until dessert that I noticed it. My mother's silver cake server, the one with the ornate handle and delicate engraving, being used to cut and serve the chocolate cake Melanie had provided. The server that should have been locked away, with the rest of the tea service in my bedroom closet. I said nothing, but my gaze lingered on it a moment too long. Thomas, ever vigilant, noticed. "Is something wrong, Mom?" he asked, his tone suggesting I should certainly say no. "Not at all," I replied, accepting a slice of cake. "I was just admiring the silver. It looks lovely on Melanie's table." A momentary silence fell, broken by my youngest grandson's innocent question. "Isn't that yours, Grandma? Didn't it belong to your mom?" Children, with their unerring instinct for truth, often cut straight to the heart of adult pretense. "Yes, Jacob, it was mine," I said gently. "It's very special because it belonged to my mother, and her mother, before her." "Then why is it here instead of at your house?" he persisted, oblivious to the tension suddenly crackling around the table. Melanie laughed, a brittle sound. "Grandma wanted me to have it, sweetheart. She has so many special things. She's sharing some with Daddy and me." I took a bite of chocolate cake, buying time to decide how to respond. The old Lenora would have let it go, sacrificing truth on the altar of family harmony. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "Actually," I said, my voice mild but clear, "I didn't give the silver to your mother. She took it from my house without asking me." Silence dropped like a stone. "Mother," Melanie hissed, We agreed to set aside our differences for the evening," I finished for her. "Not to lie to the children." Thomas cleared his throat. "This isn't the time or place. When would be the right time and place?" I asked. "When I'm safely tucked away at Sunny Pines? When I'm dead? When exactly would it be convenient for me to tell the truth about my own possessions?" Jacob looked confused, his gaze darting between his mother and me. "Mom took your stuff without asking? That's stealing." "Jacob!" Melanie's face flushed dark red. "Go to your room. Now." "But I didn't do anything wrong." "Now, Jacob!" He pushed back from the table, eyes welling with tears, and ran from the room. The other grandchildren sat frozen, wide-eyed at this dramatic turn in what had been a carefully orchestrated family dinner. I set down my fork. "I should go." "Yes, you should," Melanie agreed, her voice tight with fury, "since you clearly can't respect our agreement to keep the peace for one evening." I looked around the table at my family, my son and daughter, their spouses, my grandchildren, all watching this uncomfortable scene unfold with varying degrees of embarrassment and confusion. "I respect truth more than false peace," I said, rising from my chair. "And I respect these children too much to model dishonesty for them, even when honesty is uncomfortable." I walked around the table to where my oldest granddaughter sat, bending to kiss her cheek. "I'm sorry dinner ended this way, Emma. I'll call you tomorrow about those college applications." She nodded, squeezing my hand briefly. "It's okay, Grandma." One by one, I said goodbye to each grandchild, promising to see them soon under better circumstances. Thomas and Melanie didn't rise to see me out. As I drove home, I felt a curious mixture of regret and vindication. I hadn't intended to disrupt the dinner, but neither could I perpetuate the fiction that all was well, that my possessions had been freely given rather than taken. Some prices were too high, even for family harmony. At home, I kicked off my shoes and made a cup of tea, settling into Edgar's old leather chair with a sigh. The house was quiet, but it was the peaceful quiet of solitude rather than the hollow quiet of loneliness. The next morning, I woke early and drove to the local nursery, filling my trunk with flowering plants for the garden. Peonies, lavender, climbing roses for the trellis Edgar had built years ago. Gardening had always been my therapy, the physical, labor and connection to growing things a balm for whatever troubled me. I was on my knees in the garden, hands deep in soil, when a small voice called my name. "Grandma?" I looked up to find Jacob standing hesitantly at the edge of the garden, his bicycle thrown down on the lawn behind him. "Jacob," I said, sitting back on my heels. This is a surprise. He shuffled closer, hands in his pockets. Mom doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm at hockey practice. I see. I pulled off my gardening gloves. Is something wrong? He kicked at a clump of grass. I wanted to say sorry about last night. Mom said I embarrassed her by asking those questions. My heart clenched at the thought of this sweet child being made to feel responsible for the adult's discomfort. You have nothing to apologize for, Jacob. You asked an honest question. There's never anything wrong with that. He looked up, his expression troubled. Mom said you're making up stories because you're getting old and confused, but Dad told her to be quiet and they had a big fight after you left. I patted the garden bench beside me. Come sit for a minute. He sat, still keeping a careful distance between us, as if unsure whose side he was supposed to be on in this family conflict. Jacob, do you remember how you felt when your cousin borrowed your Pokémon cards without asking, and then said you had given them to him? He nodded vigorously. I was really mad. They were mine. And he didn't even ask. That's how I felt when I discovered your mom and Uncle Thomas had taken things from my house without asking me. I explained gently. They're special things that I care about, just like your Pokémon cards are special to you. So you're not making it up? They really did take your stuff? They really did, but it's a grown-up problem and not something you need to worry about. Your mom and Uncle Thomas and I will figure it out eventually. He considered this, his young face solemn. Is that why you gave away your house? Because they took your stuff? News traveled fast in a family, even to the youngest members. Partly, I admitted, but also because I want the house to be preserved, to be something special for the whole town to enjoy, not just sold to strangers after I'm gone. Jacob nodded, seeming to accept this explanation. Will they still have your funeral? There when you die? In the garden like you always said? With the butterflies? I smiled at his childish directness. Years ago, I told my grandchildren that when I died, I wanted a service in my garden, with butterfly releases instead of dark clothing and tears. They'd been fascinated by the idea, especially Jacob. I hope so, I said. The house will belong to the Historical Society then, but I think they'll honor that wish. They're very nice people. Good. He stood up suddenly. I better go. Mom will be mad if she finds out I came here. Wait, I said, reaching into my pocket. Take these. I pressed a small packet of seeds into his hand. Butterfly flowers. Plant them at your house, and by summer you'll have your own butterfly garden. His face lit up. Really? Cool. He tucked the seeds carefully into his pocket, then impulsively darted forward to hug me. Bye, Grandma. I love you even if you're fighting with Mom. I hugged him back, blinking away sudden tears. I love you too, Jacob. Always and no matter what. He pedaled away, looking back once to wave before disappearing around the corner. I returned to my gardening with renewed purpose, planting peonies along the fence line where they would bloom for years to come, long after I was gone. That evening, my phone rang. It was Thomas, his voice oddly subdued. Mom, we need to talk. For real this time. Not just going through the motions for the kids' sake. I agree, I said, surprised by his initiative. Patricia and I would like to come over tomorrow morning, if that's convenient. I hesitated, wondering what new strategy they had devised. But Thomas wasn't finished. And Mom? We'll be bringing back the first editions. All of them. It's time they went home where they belong. True to his word, Thomas and Patricia arrived at my doorstep the following morning at precisely 9 o'clock. Thomas carried a cardboard box that I recognized as one of Edgar's old filing boxes, the kind he used to store important documents in his study. Now it held his precious first edition books. Come in, I said, opening the door wider. I've made coffee. They followed me to the kitchen, where morning sunlight streamed through the windows. Edgar had restored himself, casting warm patterns on the worn oak table where we'd shared countless family meals. Thomas set the box down carefully. "All 12 of them," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I checked them against the inventory you made." I nodded, running my fingers along the spine of the top book. Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, its jacket slightly faded but still vibrant. Edgar had searched for months to find this particular edition, a gift for our 30th anniversary. "Thank you," I said simply. Patricia nudged Thomas gently. He cleared his throat. "Mom, I owe you an apology," he began, his words measured as if he'd rehearsed them. "Taking these books, taking any of your things without permission, was wrong. There's no excuse for it." I studied my son's face. Thomas had always been the practical one, more comfortable with spreadsheets than emotions. Apologies didn't come easily to him, which made this one all the more significant. "I appreciate that," I said quietly. "Would you like to tell me why you did it?" He shifted uncomfortably. "It's not a justification, but after Dad died, I was worried about these books sitting unprotected in your house. They're valuable, and with you living alone." "So it was concern for the book's safety?" I kept my tone neutral, giving him space to continue. Thomas flushed. "Partly, and partly." He hesitated. "Go on," I encouraged. "I was afraid you might decide to sell them or give them away to someone outside the family. These were Dad's prized possessions." I poured coffee into 3 mugs, taking time to absorb his words. "These books were indeed precious to your father. That's why I wanted them to stay exactly where he placed them until I decided it was time to pass them on. Perhaps to your son William, who shares your father's love of literature." Thomas looked stricken. "I didn't think—" "No," I agreed gently. "You didn't." Patricia reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Lenora, since we're being honest, I should tell you this wasn't entirely Thomas's idea. We had Robert and Melanie over for dinner one evening about 6 months ago, and the conversation turned to, well, to your eventual passing and what would happen to your possessions." I raised an eyebrow. "Planning my estate distribution before I'm gone. How efficient." Patricia winced at my sarcasm. "I know how it sounds, but Melanie was concerned that without a detailed will, things might get messy. She suggested it might be easier if certain items were already settled in their final homes." "I see." I took a sip of coffee, letting the bitterness wash over my tongue. "And the silver tea service? The Vienna crystal? My mother's jewelry? Were those also being settled in their final homes for safekeeping?" Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. It got out of hand. Once we started, it was easy to rationalize taking more. Melanie would mention something she'd always admired, and I'd think of something else, and before we knew it, "Before you knew it, you were systematically looting my house," I finished for him. "Yes," he admitted, the word barely audible. We sat in silence for a moment, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, another family heirloom they hadn't managed to remove yet, marking the seconds. "Where do we go from here?" Thomas finally asked. I considered the question carefully. "That depends on what you and Melanie are willing to do. The books are a start, but there's more to be returned. And more importantly, there's trust to be rebuilt." "I'll talk to Melanie," Thomas promised, "about returning everything." "She won't like it," Patricia murmured. "No, she won't," Thomas agreed. "But it's the right thing to do." I studied my son, seeing something in him I hadn't noticed in years, a glimpse of the thoughtful boy who once insisted on returning a wallet he'd found, even though it contained $50 and no identification. Perhaps that moral compass hadn't been entirely lost after all. "And the house?" Thomas asked cautiously. "Is there any chance—" "No," I said firmly. "That decision is final. The donation to the Historical Society stands. He nodded, accepting this with surprising grace. I understand. I don't agree with it, but I understand why you did it. After they left, I carefully returned each book to its proper place in Edgar's study. The shelves still had gaps, other volumes remained missing, but it was a start. As I slid the last book into position, my phone chimed with a text message. From Melanie. Thomas says you want all your things back. Seems petty after all these years of saying you wanted us to have them eventually. Why not just let us keep what we already have? I sighed, unsurprised by her resistance. Melanie had always had a selective memory, especially when it came to conversations about who was entitled to what. I typed a careful response to Melanie. I never said you could take what you wanted without asking. These items are part of our family history and deserve to be treated with respect. That includes respecting my wishes about when and how they're passed down. Her reply came almost immediately. From Melanie. Fine. I'll bring everything back next week. Happy now? To Melanie. This isn't about making me happy. It's about doing what's right. She didn't respond. True to her word, though clearly not happy about it, Melanie arrived the following Tuesday with her SUV loaded with boxes. She barely spoke as she and her husband Robert carried them into my living room, stacking them haphazardly near the fireplace. That's everything, she said tersely, dusting off her hands. I opened the nearest box, finding my mother's silver tea service wrapped in old kitchen towels rather than the acid-free cloth I'd kept it in for decades. Further inspection revealed the crystal decanter set, various pieces of jewelry, and several porcelain figurines I'd collected during my museum career. Thank you, I said, looking up to find Melanie watching me with thinly veiled resentment. You know, she said, most mothers would be happy to see their daughters enjoying their things, while they're still alive to see it. Most daughters would ask permission first, I countered. Robert, never comfortable with confrontation, edged toward the door. I'll wait in the car, Mel. After he left, Melanie's controlled facade crumbled slightly. Why are you doing this, Mother? Why now, after all these years of being? You know? Being what exactly? Being so accommodating, so willing to put everyone else first. Her voice had a plaintive quality I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. You've never stood up to any of us like this before. I considered her words carefully. She was right, in her way. I had spent decades being the family peacekeeper, the one who smoothed ruffled feathers and made sacrifices to keep harmony intact. Perhaps that was my mistake, I said softly. Perhaps by never setting boundaries, I taught you and Thomas that my wishes didn't matter, that taking without asking was acceptable because I would always forgive, always accommodate, always put your happiness above my own dignity. Melanie looked genuinely confused. But that's what mothers do, isn't it? Dad always said your greatest quality was how selfless you were. A pang shot through me at her words. Edgar had indeed praised my selflessness, meant it as the highest compliment. But in that moment, I wondered if that quality, so admired, so encouraged in women of my generation, had ultimately done a disservice to my children, teaching them to expect self-abnegation from me as their due. Selflessness doesn't mean becoming a doormat, Melanie. It doesn't mean allowing oneself to be taken advantage of, even by one's children. She shook her head, as if my words were in a language she couldn't quite translate. I just don't understand why you've changed. The question caught me off guard. Why had I changed? What had finally pushed me to stand up for myself after 7 decades of accommodation? I haven't changed, I said slowly, realizing the truth as I spoke it. I've simply stopped hiding parts of myself to make others comfortable. The woman who filed for divorce from your father when he cheated on me, the curator who stood up to the museum board when they wanted to sell off indigenous artifacts, the mother who refused to let you drop out of college despite your tearful pleas. She was Always there. I just stopped letting her voice be silenced for the sake of peace. Melanie stared at me for a long moment. I liked the other version of you better, she said finally. She was easier. I smiled sadly. I'm sure she was, but she's gone now. And I can't bring her back. I wouldn't want to, even if I could. After Melanie left, I spent the rest of the day unpacking the boxes, properly cleaning and storing each item. The work was physical and emotional, each object carrying its own weight of memory. By evening, I was exhausted but satisfied, my home, once again filled with the treasures that marked my family's history. The next morning, I had just finished breakfast when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Caroline West from the Historical Society, practically bouncing with excitement. "We got it!" she exclaimed, waving a letter. "The State Preservation Grant. It's official. We can begin the museum conversion planning in earnest." I ushered her in, genuinely pleased by her enthusiasm. "That's wonderful news, Caroline. When do you start?" "The committee meets next week to review the architectural proposals." She spread several folders on my kitchen table. "I wanted to show you the options first, get your input before we make any decisions." We spent the next hour reviewing floor plans and renovation timelines. All the proposals maintained the historical integrity of the house while making select areas accessible to the public. As promised, my private living quarters would remain untouched for as long as I needed them. "This is really happening, isn't it?" I said, a touch of wonder in my voice. Caroline smiled warmly. "It is, thanks to you. This house will be preserved. For generations to come, children will take field trips here, learning about Victorian architecture and local history. Researchers will study the original features. It's a tremendous gift to the community, Lenora." Her words brought unexpected tears to my eyes. For decades, this house had been simply my home, the backdrop to my family's daily life. Now it would have a new purpose, a broader significance that extended beyond my lifetime or even my grandchildren's. "Edgar would have loved that," I said softly. "He put so much of himself into restoring this old place. He always said houses like this weren't really owned, just temporarily stewarded for future generations." Caroline squeezed my hand. "He was right, and you're honoring his vision in the most meaningful way possible." After she left, I found myself wandering through the rooms with a new perspective, seeing them not just as the familiar spaces of my daily life, but as future exhibits, repositories of history that would outlast me. The grand staircase with its hand-carved newel post, the parlor with its original crown molding, the stained glass window on the landing that cast jewel-toned light across the floor on sunny afternoons. Edgar and I had spent years uncovering and restoring these features, stripping away layers of paint and wallpaper to reveal the house's original beauty. Now that work would be preserved, appreciated by people who valued historical integrity as much as we had. It felt right, even if my children couldn't yet see it. The following week brought a cascade of changes. I began my Italian language course, fumbling through pronunciations alongside fellow seniors, all of us laughing at our clumsy attempts to roll our R's. The photography class took a field trip to the botanical gardens, where I discovered a talent for macro photography, capturing the intricate details of flower petals and insect wings. At home, Thomas stopped by twice, each time returning more items he'd recovered from his own house, or persuaded Melanie to surrender. The house was gradually returning to its former state, though I noticed some pieces, my grandmother's garnet, earrings in particular, remained conspicuously absent. "Melanie says she can't find them," Thomas explained apologetically. "She thinks one of the kids might have taken them to play dress-up." I doubted this explanation but chose not to press the issue. Some battles weren't worth fighting, and at 73, I was becoming more selective about where I spent my energy. Then came the dinner party invitation from Harriet Simon, my oldest friend and the attorney who had handled the house donation. Nothing formal, she insisted over the phone. Just a few friends from the old museum days and that handsome new history professor from the community college. Did I mention he's single? And Italian? I laughed at her transparent matchmaking. Harriet, I'm 73 years old. I'm not looking for romance. Who said anything about romance? She replied innocently. I just thought you might enjoy conversing in Italian with a native speaker, although he is rather distinguished-looking for 65. I agreed to attend, more to stop her good-natured badgering than from any interest in meeting eligible professors. Still, when the evening arrived, I found myself taking unusual care with my appearance, a touch of lipstick, my best silk blouse, the pearl earrings Edgar had given me on our 40th anniversary. Just being respectful of the occasion, I told my reflection sternly. Harriet's dinner party was lively, filled with interesting people my own age who were still engaged with the world, still curious, still living purposefully. The Italian professor, Marco Ricci, turned out to be charming and erudite, with a quick wit and expressive hands that punctuated his conversation. He seemed genuinely impressed by my fledgling Italian skills and insisted on speaking to me in his native language throughout dinner, gently correcting my pronunciation and applauding my efforts. La tua pronuncia è molto buona per una principiante, he said, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. Grazie, sei molto gentile, I replied, pleasantly surprised that I could understand and respond. By dessert, we had discovered a shared passion for Renaissance art and a mutual disdain for modern museum layouts that prioritized gift shops over exhibition space. When he asked for my phone number to continue our conversation about the controversial restoration of the Sistine Chapel, I found myself giving it without hesitation. As Harriet walked me to my car after the party, she was practically smug. Well, wasn't I right about Marco? Such a distinguished man, and so knowledgeable about art history. He was very pleasant company, I conceded, refusing to give her the satisfaction of more enthusiasm. She laughed. Lenora Buckminster, I've known you for 40 years. You haven't been that animated in conversation since Edgar was alive. Admit it, you enjoyed yourself. I smiled in spite of myself. Yes, I did. But don't start planning the wedding just yet, Harriet. I'm perfectly content with my life as it is. Of course you are, she said, patting my arm. But being content doesn't mean you can't add a little spice now and then. I drove home through the quiet streets of Millfield, pondering her words. Was I truly content? The past few months had been tumultuous, filled with conflict and difficult decisions. Yet underneath the turbulence, I'd discovered a bedrock of certainty about who I was and what I valued. That felt like something more profound than mere contentment. It felt like authenticity. The house was dark when I arrived, no welcoming lights left on by family members awaiting my return. I found I didn't mind the solitude. It was peaceful, entirely mine to shape however I wished. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with a text message. I expected it to be Harriet, checking that I'd arrived home safely, but instead it was from an unknown number. It was a pleasure meeting you this evening, Lenora. Perhaps you would consider joining me for a coffee and continue our discussion about Caravaggio's use of chiaroscuro. Marco. I smiled at the formality of his text. So different from the abbreviated messages my grandchildren sent. I typed a careful reply. I would enjoy that very much. Next week, perhaps, after my Italian class on Wednesday. Lenora. His response came immediately. Perfetto. I look forward to it. I set the phone aside, a curious warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with connection, with being seen and heard as my full self, not just as someone's mother or grandmother or widow. The next morning, I woke early and decided to tackle the attic, inspired by my conversation with Marco about art restoration. Somewhere up there, packed away in Edgar's old portfolio cases, were my own modest paintings from the art classes I'd taken in my 20s, before marriage and motherhood had filled my days with other priorities. The attic was dusty but well organized, thanks to my periodic decluttering efforts over the years. I found the portfolio case exactly where I remembered, tucked behind Edgar's old golf clubs and a box of Thomas's high school trophies. The watercolors. Inside were amateurish but earnest, studies of the harbor near our first apartment, still lifes of flowers from our tiny garden, a portrait of Edgar napping in a patch of sunlight. Looking at them now, with decades of art history knowledge and critical perspective, I could see their technical flaws, but also their genuine emotion. They were the work of a young woman who loved beauty and tried, with limited skill but great sincerity, to capture it. "Not bad, Nora," I murmured, using Edgar's old nickname for me. Not Caravaggio, but not bad at all. I was still examining the paintings when my phone rang. It was Thomas. "Mom, have you checked your email this morning?" His voice had an odd tension. "No, why?" "You should, right away. Then call me back." Puzzled and slightly alarmed, I descended from the attic and went to my computer. My email inbox showed several new messages, including one from a name I didn't recognize, with the subject line, "Your house donation, public records request." I opened it with growing unease. "Dear Mrs. Buckminster, I am researching an article about private property donations to public institutions for the Millfield Gazette. Through a public records request, I have obtained documents related to your recent donation of your residence to the Millfield Historical Society. I would appreciate the opportunity to interview you about this generous gift and to clarify some questions raised by community members, particularly regarding the timing of the donation and any family discussions that preceded it. As you may be aware, your daughter Melanie Torres has already provided some insights, but I would like to include your perspective as well. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to arrange an interview. Sincerely, Diane Harmon. Investigative. Reporter, Millfield Gazette. My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading. Melanie had gone to the newspaper, had aired our family's private business to a reporter. I immediately called Thomas back. "Did you know about this?" I demanded. When he answered, "Not until this morning," he said grimly. "Melanie didn't tell me she was talking to a reporter. I found out when Patricia's cousin, who works at the Gazette, called to warn us that a story was in the works." "What exactly did Melanie tell them?" Thomas sighed heavily. "According to Patricia's cousin, Melanie suggested that your decision wasn't entirely voluntary, that you might have been influenced or pressured by the Historical Society, that you weren't fully cognizant of what you were giving away. She's implying I'm incompetent?" My voice rose in disbelief. "Not in those exact words, but yes, that's the implication. She's trying to lay groundwork for challenging the donation." I closed my eyes, a complex mixture of emotions washing over me, anger, disappointment, and beneath it all, a profound sadness that my daughter would go to such lengths rather than accept my decision. "I need to stop this," I said firmly. "The last thing I want is our family's private matters splashed across the local paper." "I've already called Harriet," Thomas said. "She's preparing a cease and desist letter to the Gazette. But, Mom, you might want to talk to Melanie directly. Try to understand why she's so desperate about this." I was silent for a moment, considering his suggestion. "What do you think her reason is? You know her better than anyone." Thomas was quiet so long I thought we'd lost the connection. Finally, he spoke, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "I think it's not really about the house or the money. I think it's about feeling that you chose strangers, the Historical Society, the community, over her, over us." His insight struck me like a physical blow. "That's not what happened. That's not what I meant to happen." "I know that," he said. "But Melanie, she's always been more sensitive, more likely to interpret things in the worst possible way, especially when it comes to you." After we hung up, I sat for a long time, turning Thomas's words over in my mind. Had Melanie truly interpreted my decision about the house as a rejection of her? As choosing strangers over my own children? The thought was painful, but as I examined it, I could see how she might have reached that conclusion. Especially given our complicated history, the subtle competitions and comparisons that had shadowed our relationship since her childhood. I reached for my phone and did something I rarely did. I called my daughter directly instead of waiting for her to contact me. "Mother?" Her voice was wary when she answered. "Is something wrong?" "We need to talk, Melanie. In person, as soon as possible." There was a pause. "I'm very busy today." "It's about the newspaper reporter," I interrupted. "The one you've been speaking to about my house donation." Another, longer pause. "Oh, yes. Oh, I think this conversation would be better in person, don't you?" She sighed. "Fine, I can come by this afternoon around 4. "Thank you, I'll see you then." I spent the intervening hours alternating between righteous anger and attempts at empathy. By the time Melanie's car pulled into my driveway, I had settled on an approach that I hoped would get us past recriminations to the heart of the matter. She entered cautiously, as if expecting an ambush. "I guess Thomas told you about the reporter." Actually, the reporter emailed me directly. I led her to the living room, where I'd set out tea and the almond cookies she'd always loved as a child. "Sit down, please." She perched on the edge of the sofa, ignoring the refreshments. "I suppose you're furious." "I'm disappointed," I said honestly. "And I'm trying to understand why you would take such a drastic step rather than continue talking with me directly." Melanie looked away. "You weren't listening. You'd made up your mind about the house, and nothing any of us said made any difference. So you decided to force my hand by suggesting to a newspaper reporter that I'm not competent to make my own decisions?" Her cheeks flushed. "That's not exactly what I said." "What did you say exactly?" She shifted uncomfortably. "I just suggested that the Historical Society might have taken advantage of an elderly widow who didn't fully understand the implications of what she was giving away." "Melanie, I'm a retired museum curator with a master's degree in art history. I spent 40 years handling acquisitions and donations. I think I understand the implications of property transfers better than most people in this town." She had the grace to look embarrassed. "I know, it's just, I was desperate. We'd tried everything else to change your mind." I leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. "The question is why? Why is this house so important to you? Why can't you accept that I want it preserved rather than sold after I'm gone?" Melanie looked down at her hands. "Because it's not fair," she said, her voice suddenly small. "You're choosing to give away our inheritance, Thomas's and mine, to people who aren't even family. These historical society people, the town. They didn't take care of you all these years. They didn't come over when Dad died to help sort through his clothes. They didn't bring you meals or check on you during snowstorms or help with the yard work." "No," I agreed softly. "You did those things, you and Thomas. So why are they getting the house?" She looked up, and to my surprise, I saw tears in her eyes. "Why are strangers getting what should have been ours? What we earned by being good children to you?" And there it was, the transactional view of family that had never occurred to me until this moment. The idea that love and care were investments that should be repaid in material terms. That inheritance was something earned rather than freely given. "Oh, Melanie." I reached for her hand. "Is that what you think? That you were taking care of me all these years as some sort of payment plan for eventual inheritance?" She withdrew her hand sharply. "Of course not. But it's normal, isn't it? Parents pass their assets to their children. That's how it works. That's the natural order of things." I considered her words carefully. It is traditional, yes, but it's not an obligation. It's a choice. My choice. About what happens to my property after I'm gone. But why would you choose strangers over your own children? Her voice cracked with genuine hurt. I'm not choosing strangers over you, I said gently. I'm choosing a legacy that will outlast all of us. I'm choosing to preserve something beautiful and historically significant rather than see it torn down for the cash value of the land it sits on. You don't know that's what would happen, she protested weakly. Don't I? Thomas already had a real estate agent friend evaluating the property. You and Robert were planning a vacation home in Nantucket with your share of the proceeds. Neither of you has any sentimental attachment to this house except as a financial asset. Melanie couldn't deny it. We both knew it was true. The money would have helped us, she said after a moment. Robert's business isn't doing as well as we let on. College for the kids is going to be a stretch. I understand that, I said. And I've made provisions for the grandchildren's education in my will. But this house deserves to be more than just a line item in someone's investment portfolio. She was quiet for a long time, staring at the tea I'd poured that was now growing cold. So your mind is completely made up. There's nothing I can say or do that will change. Nothing, I confirmed. But Melanie, that doesn't mean I'm choosing an institution over you. It means I'm making a decision about property that is still mine to decide about. And the newspaper article? I think you should call the reporter and retract your statements, I said firmly. If you don't, Harriet is prepared to send a cease and desist letter, and I'll give my own interview making it clear that I'm fully competent and made this decision with sound mind and careful consideration. Melanie sighed, looking suddenly tired. Fine. I'll call her. Thank you. She stood to leave but paused at the door to the living room. For what it's worth, I did bring back all your things. Even grandmother's garnet earrings. They're in the small box on top of the others. I appreciate that, I said, genuinely surprised and touched by this concession. After she left, I found the box with the garnet earrings exactly where she'd described. They were tangled and in need of cleaning, but intact. As I carefully separated the delicate gold chains, I reflected on our conversation. We hadn't resolved everything, far from it. But perhaps we'd taken a small step toward understanding each other's perspective. For the first time, I'd glimpsed the hurt beneath Melanie's anger, the feeling of rejection that had driven her to such desperate measures. And maybe, just maybe, she'd begun to see that my decision wasn't about choosing strangers over my children, but about honoring a different kind of value, one that couldn't be measured in dollars or divided like an inheritance. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, my phone chimed with a message from Marco Ricci. I'm looking forward to our coffee next week. In the meantime, I wondered if you might be interested in a lecture. On Florentine architecture at the college tomorrow evening? I'm the guest speaker, so I can promise at least moderately intelligent commentary. I smiled at his self-deprecating humor and found myself typing a reply before I could overthink it. I would be delighted. Perhaps we could have dinner afterward. And continue the conversation? His response was immediate. Even better. I'll pick you up at 6:30 if that's convenient. Perfect, I replied. I look forward to it. As I set my phone aside, I realized I was smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in days. Life was moving forward in unexpected ways. New friendships, new interests, new possibilities I hadn't anticipated. The house around me, with all its history and memories, would be preserved for future generations. My relationship with my children, though strained, was not beyond repair. And I, Lenora Buckminster, age 73, was not at the end of my story, but in the midst of a surprising new chapter. I raised my teacup in a silent toast to the fading sun. Well, Edgar, I whispered to the evening air. I think we're going to be all right. All of us, in our own ways. And for the first time since his death, I truly believed it. Marco arrived precisely at 6:30 the following evening, dressed in a well-tailored navy blazer and carrying a small bouquet of yellow tulips. Standing on my doorstep, he had the slightly nervous air of a much younger man, which I found both endearing and comical. "For you?" he said, presenting the flowers with a small bow. Yellow tulips represent cheerful thoughts in the language of flowers, at least according to my grandmother, who was quite insistent about these things. "They're lovely," I said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Please come in while I put them in water." I led him to the kitchen, where he admired the original tile work while I arranged the tulips in a crystal vase, one of the items Melanie had recently returned. "Your home is extraordinary," he said, running an appreciative hand over the oak. "Wainscoting. The craftsmanship. You don't see work like this anymore." "My husband spent years restoring it," I explained. He was determined to preserve as many original features as possible. "He had excellent taste," Marco said. Then, added with a warm smile, "in homes and in wives." I felt a ridiculous flutter at the compliment, like a schoolgirl rather than a septuagenarian widow. "Let me get my wrap, and we can be on our way." The lecture was held in the college's small auditorium, a mid-century building that had been modernized with better lighting and sound systems while preserving its architectural character. A modest crowd had gathered, mostly students fulfilling course requirements, judging by their restless energy, but also a sprinkling of faculty and community members with genuine interest in the subject. Marco's lecture was engaging and accessible, filled with beautiful images of Florentine buildings and illuminated by personal anecdotes of growing up in their shadows. He spoke with the easy confidence of someone who loved his subject and wanted to share that passion rather than merely demonstrate his expertise. When he showed a slide of the Uffizi Gallery, I felt a pang of nostalgia. Edgar and I had visited Florence in our 40s, spending an entire day in the Uffizi, marveling at Botticelli's Birth of Venus and Caravaggio's Medusa. It had been one of our happiest trips before the pressures of career advancement and child-rearing had begun to pull us in different directions. After the lecture, several students gathered around Marco with questions. I hung back, content, to watch him in his element, noting the way his hands moved expressively as he spoke, the genuine interest he took in even the most basic questions. Finally, the last student departed, and he turned to me with a smile. "Dinner? I know a small Italian place nearby. It's not quite Florence, but the owner is from Sicily and makes a passable carbonara." The restaurant was tucked away on a side street, its entrance marked only by a small sign and twinkling white lights wrapped around a potted olive tree. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and intimate, with brick walls, wooden tables set with white linen and soft Italian music playing in the background. The owner, a burly man with an impressive mustache, greeted Marco like an old friend, rattling off in rapid Italian before switching to English when he noticed me. "Marco, who is this lovely lady? You've been holding out on me." "Antonio, this is Lenora Buckminster." "Lenora, Antonio Russo, an old friend and purveyor of the best risotto outside of Milan." Antonio kissed my hand with dramatic flair. "Enchanted, signora. Any friend of Marco's is family here." He seated us at a corner table, brought a bottle of Chianti without being asked, and promised to send out his best dishes for us to try. "He's quite a character," I said after he'd bustled away. Marco smiled. "Antonio and I met when I first moved to Millfield 10 years ago. I was homesick for proper Italian food, wandered in here, and we've been friends ever since." 10 years? I'm surprised our paths haven't crossed before now. "I spent much of that time caring for my mother," he explained. "She had Alzheimer's and lived with me until her death last year. I didn't socialize much during those years." I'm sorry, I said, recognizing the particular exhaustion that came with long-term caregiving. That must have been difficult. It was, he admitted, but also valuable in its own way. I got to know my mother again in those years, not as the formidable matriarch who raised 5 children in post-war Italy, but as a vulnerable human being who still had moments of sharp humor and unexpected tenderness even as her mind failed her. His openness touched me. Most men I knew, particularly of our generation, were reluctant to discuss the emotional aspects of caregiving. My husband died 5 years ago, I said. A sudden heart attack. No long illness, no chance to say proper goodbyes. Marco nodded. Each kind of loss has its own challenges. With my mother, there were 1,000 small goodbyes over years. With your husband, a single moment that changed everything. Yes, exactly. Antonio returned with a parade of antipasti, grilled vegetables drizzled with olive oil, paper-thin, prosciutto, marinated olives, crusty bread for dipping in herb-infused olive oil. The conversation flowed as easily as the wine, touching on art, travel, books, and eventually, family. I found myself telling Marco about Thomas and Melanie, about the conflict over the house donation and the stolen heirlooms. It was a relief to speak openly with someone who had no stake in the situation, no preconceived notions about who I should be or how I should behave. You've been very courageous, he said after I finished. Standing up to one's children is never easy, even when it's necessary. Courageous or foolhardy? I asked with a wry smile. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just let them have their way. It would certainly have been simpler. Marco shook his head firmly. Simpler, yes, but at what cost to your dignity? To your sense of self? You sound like you speak from experience. He twirled pasta around his fork, considering. My children were disappointed when I sold the family home in Florence after my mother died. They had expected to inherit it, even though none of them wanted to live there. They simply wanted the asset. Exactly. It's not about the house itself, but what it represents financially. Precisely. I sold it to a cousin who actually wanted to raise his family there, to keep it in the family in a meaningful way. My children eventually came to terms with my decision, though it took time. That gives me hope, I said. Though Melanie, my daughter, seems particularly resistant. Children often have complicated relationships with family property, Marco observed. It represents not just financial security, but emotional connections, to childhood, to family history, to their perceived place in the family hierarchy. His insight resonated with something I'd been trying to articulate about Melanie's reaction. I think my daughter feels that by donating the house, rather than leaving it to her, I'm saying she doesn't deserve it, that she hasn't earned her place in the family legacy. Marco nodded. It becomes a judgment in their eyes, not a practical decision about property. The conversation continued through dessert, a heavenly tiramisu that Antonio insisted we try, and coffee. By the time Marco drove me home, it was nearly 11 o'clock, far later than I usually stayed out these days. I've kept you out scandalously late, he said as he walked me to my door. Your neighbors will talk. I laughed. Let them. It might improve my reputation. Lately I'm known as the stubborn old woman who disinherited her children. His expression grew serious. I hope I'm not being too forward, Lenora, but I've enjoyed your company immensely this evening. Would you consider joining me for a concert? This weekend? The college orchestra is performing Vivaldi's Four Seasons. I'd like that very much, I said, surprised by how much I meant it. His smile was warm as he took my hand and pressed a courtly kiss to my knuckles. Until Saturday, then. Buonanotte, Lenora. Buonanotte, Marco. I watched him drive away, feeling oddly light despite the late hour and the emotional conversations of the evening. It had been so long since I'd connected with someone new, especially someone who seemed to understand intuitively the complexities of family relationships in later life. Inside, I noticed a text message from Thomas. "Mom, please call when you get this, no matter how late. Important news about Melanie." My heart skipped anxiously. Had something happened to my daughter? I called immediately despite the hour. Thomas answered on the first ring. "Mom, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours." "I was out to dinner," I said, not elaborating. "What's happening with Melanie?" He sighed heavily. "She's not hurt, if that's what you're worried about. But she's decided to contest the house donation after all. She's hired Jenkins from that aggressive estate firm downtown." My momentary relief that Melanie wasn't physically injured quickly gave way to dismay. "After our conversation yesterday? After she promised to call off the newspaper story?" "She did call off the newspaper," Thomas clarified. "But apparently she spoke to a lawyer today who told her there might be grounds to challenge the donation, based on undue influence from the Historical Society." I sank into the nearest chair, suddenly exhausted. "That's absurd. No one influenced me except Melanie and you, with your unauthorized removal of my possessions." "I know that, Mom, and I've told her it's a losing battle. Jenkins is just taking her money for nothing." "Have you spoken to her directly? What is she thinking?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "She's not being rational about this. Robert called me earlier. He said she's been obsessing over the house since your confrontation, staying up all night researching legal precedents, talking about family betrayal. He's worried about her." A cold fear settled in my stomach. "Do you think she needs professional help?" "Maybe," Thomas admitted. This reaction seems extreme, even for Melanie. She's always been emotional, but this is different. Robert says she keeps talking about how she'll never measure up in your eyes, how you've always loved the house more than her. His words confirmed what I'd begun to suspect during our last conversation, that Melanie's fixation on the house went beyond financial considerations to something deeper and more painful. Some childhood wound I'd never fully recognized, some insecurity about her place in my affections that had festered for decades. "I should talk to her again," I said. "Not tonight," Thomas advised. "Robert said she finally took a sleeping pill and went to bed. Let's give her until tomorrow." After we hung up, I sat in the darkened living room, trying to piece together where I had gone wrong with Melanie. Had I somehow, without realizing it, made her feel less valued than this house? Had my passion for preserving its historical features, my pride in Edgar's restoration work, somehow communicated that I cared more about a structure than my own daughter? I didn't think so, but perception could be a powerful thing. And children often interpret parental actions through lenses we can't anticipate or control. The next morning, I called Robert directly, something I rarely did. He answered with the harried tone of a man at the end of his rope. "Lenora, I'm glad you called. Melanie's not herself. She didn't sleep more than a few hours even with the pill, and she's already on the phone with that lawyer again." "Can I speak with her?" I asked. "Hold on." I heard muffled conversation, then Melanie's voice, tight with suppressed emotion. "What do you want, Mother?" "I want to understand," I said simply. "Help me understand why this is so important to you. Not the financial aspect. I know about Robert's business struggles, something deeper." There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of her breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice had a raw quality I hadn't heard since she was a teenager, struggling through her first heartbreak. "You've always loved that house more than me." The pain in those words took my breath away. "Melanie, that's not true." "Isn't it? Growing up, you and Dad were always working on the house, restoring this, preserving that. Every weekend, every spare dollar went into the house. And when I wanted attention, When I needed help with homework or wanted to talk about school problems, you'd say, "Not now, we have to finish this plasterwork before it sets." Or later, we're in the middle of stripping paint. I closed my eyes, memories flooding back. Melanie hovering in doorways while Edgar and I worked, her school art projects displayed, but perhaps not fully appreciated amid our focus on historical accuracy and architectural detail. "You were so proud of that damn house," she continued, her voice rising. "You'd give tours to your museum friends, pointing out all the original features you'd saved, the period-appropriate renovations. But when I brought home a straight-A report card or won the lead in the school play, it was just, 'That's nice, dear,' before going back to discussing which shade of Victorian blue was historically accurate for the dining room. "I didn't realize," I began, but she cut me off. "And now, after all these years, when you have a chance to leave me something that actually mattered to you, something you valued, you're giving it to strangers. Do you have any idea how that feels? It's like one final confirmation that the house always came first, that it always will." My heart ached at the pain in her voice, at the realization that my passion for historic preservation, which had seemed so benign and even virtuous to me, had been experienced by my young daughter as competition for my attention and affection. "Melanie, I never meant to make you feel less important than the house," I said softly. "Your father and I loved you more than anything, but we were young parents, figuring things out as we went along. We probably got too caught up in the restoration project, let it become too all-consuming." "You think?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm, but beneath it I heard the wounded child she had been. "I can't change the past," I acknowledged. "But I want you to know that my decision to donate the house wasn't about choosing it over you. It was about ensuring its preservation. Yes, because I value its history, but also because your father put so much of himself into it. It's his legacy, too." She was quiet for so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, she spoke, her voice steadier. "I hired the lawyer to fight you. I know, Thomas told me. He says I can challenge the donation on grounds of undue influence." "You can try," I said. "But there was no undue influence, Melanie. This was my decision, made carefully and with full understanding of what I was doing." "So you're not going to fight me on this? You're just going to let me waste money on legal fees for a case even my own brother says I can't win?" I considered her question carefully. "No, I'm not just going to let you waste your money. I'm going to suggest something else entirely." "What?" Her curiosity was piqued despite her anger. "Come to the house tomorrow. Just you, no lawyers, no family members. I want to show you something." "What kind of something?" "Something that might help you understand my decision better. Will you come? Say 10 o'clock? She hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, 10 o'clock tomorrow." After we hung up, I spent the rest of the day preparing for her visit. I pulled boxes from the attic, sorted through albums and scrapbooks, and made a phone call to Caroline West at the Historical Society. "It's an unusual request," Caroline admitted, "but I think we can accommodate it. The board will need to approve, of course, but given that it was your donation in the first place." "Thank you," I said, relief flooding through me. "I believe this may help resolve the situation with my daughter." The next morning dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect spring days that make even the oldest homes in Millfield look freshly painted and welcoming. I had just finished setting out coffee and the almond cookies Melanie favored when her car pulled into the driveway precisely at 10. She entered with the wary expression of someone expecting an ambush, declining my offer of coffee with a tight shake of her head. "You said you wanted to show me something?" "Yes, several things, actually. Let's start here." I led her to the dining room table, where I'd laid out a series of photo albums in chronological order. The first one was open to a faded color photograph of Edgar and me, impossibly young, standing proudly in front of the dilapidated Victorian we had just purchased. Your father and I bought this house the year before you were born, I explained. It was in terrible condition, leaking roof, crumbling plaster, outdated wiring that was a fire hazard. The previous owners had divided it into apartments, destroying many of the original features. I turned the page to show more before photos, peeling wallpaper, damaged floors, missing balusters on the staircase. We were in over our heads. Honestly, neither of us knew the first thing about restoration. But we were young and idealistic, determined to save this beautiful old house from being torn down to make way for a parking lot. Melanie reluctantly sat down, her gaze drawn to the photographs despite her efforts to remain detached. I flipped forward a few pages to a picture of her as a newborn, cradled in Edgar's arms as he sat in a half-demolished room, plaster dust, covering his clothes. You were born in the middle of all this chaos. We brought you home to a house with only one properly finished room, the nursery. Your father had worked night and day to get it ready for you, painting the walls, refinishing the floor, installing a new window with proper insulation so you wouldn't get cold. I continued through the albums, showing her pictures of herself growing up alongside the house's transformation. Here she was as a toddler, helping Edgar sand a banister by ineffectually waving a piece of sandpaper. Here at age 5, solemnly holding a paintbrush as I guided her hand to apply color to the parlor walls. Here at 10, proudly showing off the hall closet she had organized as her own contribution to the restoration project. Your father and I didn't work on this house instead of loving you, Melanie. We worked on it for you, to give you a beautiful, safe place to grow up, to create a legacy that would be part of your history too. She traced a finger over a photo of herself in Edgar's lap, both of them covered in sawdust and grinning at the camera. I don't remember him being this involved with the house. In my memories, it was mostly you. That's because he did most of his work while you were in school, I explained. He'd come home early to spend time with you before dinner, then go back to whatever project we were working on after you went to bed. He was determined that you wouldn't feel neglected because of the renovation. This seemed to surprise her. Really? Dad arranged his schedule around me? Of course he did. You were his princess. Why do you think he insisted on making your bedroom the first room we fully restored? He wanted you to have a perfect space of your own. I turned to the final album, showing pictures from Melanie's teenage years. There were fewer restoration photos by then. Most of the major work had been completed, and more family snapshots. Melanie's high school graduation, with Edgar beaming beside her. Family holidays gathered around the dining room table that Edgar had rescued from a salvage yard and lovingly refinished. The house was never more important than you, I said softly. It was important because of you, because it was the setting for our family life, the backdrop for all these memories. Melanie was quiet, her expression thoughtful as she studied the photographs. I still don't understand why you're giving it away. Come with me, I said, standing. There's more I want to show you. I led her upstairs to the small bedroom that had once been hers, now converted to a guest room, but still painted in the pale yellow she had chosen as a teenager. On the bed, I'd laid out more items from the attic, her school projects, report cards, programs from plays she'd appeared in, all carefully preserved in acid-free boxes. You saved all this? She asked, picking up a construction paper mother's day card she'd made in 2nd grade. Of course I did. Every drawing, every essay, every award certificate, they're all here. Next to these childhood mementos, I'd placed a thick folder filled with architectural plans and historical documentation related to the house. When your father and I restored this house, we weren't just fixing up an old building, we were preserving a piece of history. Not just our personal history, but the town's history. This house was built in 1885 by one of Millfield's founding families. It survived fires, hurricanes, economic depressions. Its story is bigger than just our family. I opened the folder to show her the original architectural drawings, the historical photographs of the house in its early days, the newspaper clippings about its famous visitors over the decades. By donating it to the Historical Society, I'm ensuring that all this history won't be lost, that the work your father and I put into restoring it won't be undone by new owners who might gut it for an open floor plan or tear it down for the land. Value. Melanie paged through the historical documents, her professional interest as an interior designer clearly engaged despite her emotional resistance. It is a remarkable example of Second Empire architecture, she admitted reluctantly. One of the finest in the state, I agreed. But there's one more thing I need to show you. The most important thing. I led her back downstairs and out to the garden, where Caroline West was waiting as arranged. She greeted Melanie warmly, then handed me a large presentation board, which I propped on an easel I'd set up earlier. This, I said, is the Historical Society's plan for the house after I'm gone. The board displayed architectural renderings of the house as a museum, with carefully designated public and private spaces. But what I wanted Melanie to see was the small brass plaque depicted in the rendering of the entrance hall. The Buckminster. House lovingly restored by Edgar and Lenora Buckminster. Dedicated to the preservation of family and community history. Gift of the Buckminster family. The Buckminster family, I emphasized. Not just me, all of us. You, Thomas, the grandchildren. This house will carry our name for generations. Children will come here on school field trips and learn about architecture, history, and preservation. Researchers will study the original features. Tourists will admire the craftsmanship. I took her hands in mine. This isn't about disinheriting you, Melanie. It's about creating a different kind of legacy, one that can't be divided or sold off, one that will still be here for your grandchildren and their grandchildren to visit and feel connected to their roots. Caroline stepped forward. The board has also approved a special provision, at your mother's request, a dedicated gallery space for rotating exhibitions of local artists and artisans, to be named the Melanie Torres Gallery in recognition of your own design talents and your family's contribution to preserving this landmark. Melanie's eyes widened. A gallery with my name on it? Your father always said you had the best eye for color and composition in the family, I said. It seemed fitting that the artistic space should honor your talents. She turned to me, tears welling in her eyes for the first time. You did this for me? Even after I hired a lawyer to fight you? I did it because despite our difficulties, you're my daughter, and I love you. Because I want you to have a meaningful connection to this house that goes beyond property value. And because I truly believe this is a better legacy than simply dividing the sale proceeds between you and Thomas. Melanie was silent for a long moment, looking between the presentation, board and the house itself as if seeing it with new eyes. I need some time to think, she said finally. This is a lot to process. Of course, I said, fighting disappointment. I had hoped for an immediate reconciliation, a tearful embrace, an acknowledgement that my plan made sense. But real change rarely happens so dramatically, especially with wounds as deep as Melanie's. Thank you for coming today, I added. For listening. Whatever you decide about the legal challenge, I'm glad we had this conversation. She nodded, then surprised me by giving me a quick, awkward hug before walking to her car. At the last moment, she turned back. The gallery? Would I have any input into how it's designed? What kinds of exhibitions it might feature? Caroline answered before I could. We would welcome your professional expertise, Ms. Torres. In fact, we were hoping you might consider serving on the exhibition committee. A small smile flickered across Melanie's face. I might be interested in that. As she drove away, Caroline turned to me with a relieved expression. I think that went better than expected. We'll see, I said cautiously. Melanie has always needed time to process emotional revelations, but I'm hopeful. Later that afternoon, I received a text from Marco. Looking forward to our concert date tomorrow. Shall I pick you up at 7? The orchestra starts at 8, but I thought we might have a glass of wine at the campus cafe beforehand. I smiled, typing back, 7 would be perfect. I'm looking forward to it as well. As I set my phone down, it chimed again with another message. This one from Melanie. I've canceled the appointment with Jenkins. We should talk more about the gallery idea. Maybe next week? Relief washed over me, followed by cautious optimism. It wasn't a full resolution, but it was a start, an opening for healing that hadn't existed before. I texted back, next week would be wonderful. How about lunch on Tuesday? My treat. Her response came quickly. Tuesday works. The little French place downtown at noon? Perfect, I replied. That evening, as twilight settled over the garden, I sat on the porch with a glass of Edgar's favorite scotch, contemplating the day's events. The house stood solid and serene behind me, its windows glowing warmly against the deepening blue of the sky. In donating it to the Historical Society, I hadn't lost my home but ensured its future. And perhaps, in finding a way to include Melanie, in that future through the gallery that would bear her name, I had begun to heal a rift I hadn't fully understood until now. We're making progress, Edgar, I said softly to the evening air. It's not perfect, but it's progress. From inside, the phone rang, Thomas calling to check how the meeting with Melanie had gone. As I rose to answer it, I cast one more glance at the twilight garden, feeling an unfamiliar but welcome sense of rightness, of things gradually falling into place. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in months, I felt confident about the path ahead. The day of the concert arrived. With picture-perfect spring weather, I spent the morning in my garden, pulling weeds and planting new perennials that would bloom long after I was gone. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, preparing beauty for future seasons I might not see, trusting in the continuity of growing things. Around noon, Thomas stopped by unexpectedly. He found me kneeling in the dirt, garden gloves smudged with soil, hair escaping from under my wide-brimmed hat. Planning to clean up before your big date tonight? He teased, helping me to my feet. How did you know about that? I asked, brushing dirt from my knees. He grinned. Small town. Patricia's cousin's husband is in the college orchestra. He mentioned that Professor Ricci requested extra rehearsal time for the Vivaldi because he was bringing a special guest. I felt myself blushing like a teenager. It's just a concert, Thomas. Of course. His smile softened. I'm happy for you, Mom. Really. We walked together to the porch, where I poured us both glasses of lemonade from a pitcher I'd prepared earlier. I spoke with Melanie this morning, Thomas said, accepting the glass. She told me about the gallery the Historical Society is naming for her. That was a brilliant idea. Not brilliant, I corrected. Just an acknowledgement that this house and its future should include all of us, in some way. Your father and I built our life here, but you and Melanie grew up here. It's part of your story, too. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. We're working on something for me as well, a reading room in Dad's study, preserving his book collection. The Thomas Buckminster reading room has a nice ring to it, don't you think? I smiled, touched by his enthusiasm. Your father would love that. He always hoped you'd develop his love of literature. I did, eventually. Just took me an extra 30 years. He hesitated, then added, I also wanted to tell you that Melanie and I have been talking about the missing heirlooms, the ones that haven't been returned yet. We figured out where most of them ended up. Oh? I kept my tone neutral, not wanting to dampen this moment of connection. Some things got sold, he admitted with visible discomfort. Robert had some business setbacks that were worse than they let on. But we're pooling resources to buy back what we can, and Melanie's going through her insurance inventory to identify anything else that should come back to you. The acknowledgement meant more to me than the actual objects. Thank you. That means a great deal. After Thomas left, I spent a luxurious hour preparing for my evening with Marco. A long bath scented with lavender oil, careful attention to my hair and makeup, and the selection of a deep blue dress I hadn't worn since Edgar's memorial service. It was a relief to wear it for a joyful occasion this time, to reclaim it from association with grief. Marco arrived promptly at 7, his appreciative gaze making me glad I'd taken such care with my appearance. "You look magnificent," he said, offering his arm as we walked to his car. The college cafe before the concert was intimate and buzzing with pre-performance energy. Faculty members stopped by our table to chat. Several students waved to Marco, and I found myself enjoying the vibrant academic atmosphere I'd missed since retiring from the museum. "You seem at home here," Marco observed between sips of wine. "I've always loved campus environments," I admitted. "The sense of possibility, of ideas in motion. You know," he said tentatively, "the art history department is looking for an adjunct to teach a course on decorative arts next semester. With your museum background, you'd be perfect." I blinked, startled by the suggestion. "Teaching? At my age? The students would benefit immensely from your expertise, and I think you might enjoy it too." The idea took root immediately, exciting in its unexpectedness. Teaching had never been part of my career path, but now, with different priorities and freedoms, it held undeniable appeal. "I'll think about it," I promised. The concert itself was sublime. Vivaldi's familiar yet eternally fresh Four Seasons performed with youthful enthusiasm by talented students. Marco's hand found mine during the slow movement of Winter, our fingers intertwining with comfortable intimacy, as if we'd known each other for years rather than weeks. Afterward, walking through the mild evening to a nearby ice cream parlor, he spoke of his hopes for an upcoming sabbatical, his plans to write a book on Renaissance architecture. "You should come to Florence with me," he said suddenly. "In the fall. The light is magnificent then, the tourists have thinned out, and I know places most visitors never discover." The invitation hung in the air between us, weighted with possibility. At 73, I'd grown cautious about future plans, conscious of time's limitations. But something about Marco's straightforward manner, his unassuming confidence that we might have a future together, touched me deeply. "I'd like that," I said simply. His smile in response was worth any uncertainty the commitment might bring. When he drove me home, the goodbye at my door held the sweet tension of nascent romance. A gentle kiss that promised more, a mutual reluctance to end the evening. I watched him drive away with a curious lightness in my chest, a feeling I'd thought long past in my life. Inside, I moved through the quiet rooms with a renewed awareness of their beauty and history. This house had sheltered my family through decades of growth and change. Now, as a museum, it would continue to shelter history itself, preserving not just architectural features but the story of the people who had loved and lived within these walls. My phone chimed with a text from Melanie. "Lunch Tuesday still on? I have some ideas for the gallery space I'd like to discuss." I replied immediately, "Looking forward to it. Bring your design portfolio if you'd like." Setting the phone aside, I walked to Edgar's study and stood before his portrait, a good likeness painted for his 60th birthday by a local artist. His kind eyes seemed to meet mine with understanding. "A lot has changed, hasn't it?" I said softly. "The house will become a museum. The children are finally returning what they took. And I seem to be dating an Italian professor." I could almost hear his chuckle, see the amused crinkle around his eyes. Edgar had never been possessive, had always encouraged me to expand my horizons. "Live fully, Nora," he'd said in his final years, aware of his heart condition even before I was. "Whatever happens, promise me you'll keep living fully." "I'm trying, Edgar," I whispered. "I really am." The next weeks unfolded with unexpected harmony. Melanie and I had our lunch, which stretched to nearly 3 hours as she shared her vision for the gallery space, a modern, flexible design that would honor the house's history while creating opportunities for contemporary artists to exhibit their work. We could feature local artisans who use traditional techniques, she suggested, her eyes bright with enthusiasm, showing the continuity between past and present craftsmanship. I watched my daughter come alive as she sketched concepts on her tablet, recognizing the passion for design I'd always encouraged, but somehow failed to fully acknowledge. In that moment, I saw clearly how my donation to the Historical Society, initially so painful for her, had created an unexpected opportunity for her talents to shine. Thomas, too, found his place in the evolving plans for the house. His financial expertise proved invaluable to the Historical Society as they developed an endowment to maintain the property. The reading room bearing his name would preserve Edgar's beloved books while creating a space for literary events and quiet research. My relationship with Marco deepened with comfortable naturalness. We attended concerts and lectures, explored bookshops and galleries, and spent long evenings discussing art and history over glasses of good wine. When he kissed me goodnight, I no longer felt the awkward self-consciousness of a widow stepping beyond propriety, but the simple joy of connection with a man who saw me clearly and valued what he saw. On a sunny Sunday in late May, I hosted a garden party, my first real entertaining since Edgar's death. The guest list reflected my expanding world: Harriet and her husband, Caroline from the Historical Society, several new friends from my Italian class and photography workshop, and, of course, Marco. To my surprise and delight, Thomas and Patricia arrived with all their children, bearing a magnificent cake from the best bakery in town. Even more unexpected was Melanie's appearance with Robert and their teenagers, all dressed for the occasion and carrying flowers from their garden. As the afternoon progressed, I watched my grandchildren playing croquet on the lawn where their parents had once played, saw Thomas and Marco deep in conversation about Italian wines, noticed Melanie showing Caroline her gallery designs on her Allet. My two worlds, family and new beginnings, were merging with unexpected grace. Later, as twilight softened the garden and Marco lit the string lights I'd hung in the old oak tree, Melanie approached me, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. She offered me one, then clinked her glass against mine. "To new beginnings," she said, "and to preserved legacies." "I'll drink to that," I replied, my heart full. Looking around at this gathering, my children and grandchildren, my new friends and potential new love, all enjoying the home that would outlast us all as a museum, I felt a profound sense of rightness. By standing firm against the theft of my possessions, by choosing preservation over simple inheritance, I had set in motion a chain of events that led not to family destruction, but to unexpected renewal. Marco caught my eye across the garden and smiled, a private look that promised many more such evenings to come. My children, seeing the exchange, shared a glance I couldn't quite interpret. Surprise, perhaps, or cautious approval. Whatever the future held, travel to Florence with Marco, teaching at the college, watching the house transformation into a museum, I would face it on my own terms, with the dignity and autonomy I had reclaimed for myself. Not as merely someone's mother or widow, but as Lenora Buckminster, a woman with her own story still unfolding, her own choices still to make. The family heirlooms my children had taken would gradually return, finding their proper places in the house-turned-museum or staying with family members who truly valued them. The house they had expected to inherit would instead become a lasting legacy for generations beyond our own. And I, who had nearly surrendered my agency to conventional expectations of elderly widowhood, had found a new chapter in life I could never have anticipated. As darkness fell and lanterns glowed throughout the garden, I raised my glass in a silent toast to unexpected outcomes, to standing firm against those who would diminish us, and to the liberating discovery that the final chapters of one's story might be the most surprising and most satisfying of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.